Welcome back. In our book review today, we speak to the author of the book Femicide in South Africa, Nechama Brodie. Her book, of course, explores the history of violence against women in the country over the past 40 years, but she joins us live now in studio to talk more about her book. Nechama, thank you for your time. Welcome.
Sure.
Listen, in as much as I feel like it's such an important conversation, I'm like, are we going to have this conversation for so long? This is one of the most heartbreaking topics, but equally important to document. I'm sure that's part of the reason why you felt the need to document this.
Well, the book is based on my doctoral research, and when my publishers came to me and said, let's do a book on femicide, I said, nobody's going to want to buy a book that's just full of dead women. And unfortunately, as we sort of know year on year, is that as the book came out, there was another spate of sort of high-profile femicides, and it's just one of those things that's always in the news, so it feels like it's always topical. But what's interesting about the book for me is, as a journalist, the way I approached the topic of femicide initially was to try and understand it through media coverage. So I looked back through 40 years' worth of media coverage of fatal violence against women to try and understand how we had been telling the story of femicide, and if it had changed. Has violence against women changed, or just the way that we report about it has changed? And I think what the evidence shows is the violence is probably the same, although generally, I mean, our murder rate has kind of increased over time, so as a part of that, femicide has increased. But what we feel like is some urgent new thing has in fact been happening for generations and really for centuries probably. I can't go back into sort of 400 years ago press archives, but this is not a new thing.
Right.
We just have new words to describe it.
Ooh. Can I just ask you to lift up the book, because I think when I also saw the image there within the book, my heart just tore, because that's exactly that's the reality of femicide as well, Nechama. And I wanted to ask, you spoke about the media and how they've been reporting on it for the past 40 years. How have you documented it in a way that it's easy to consume when it comes to reading, and it's not just the names of the victims?
It's a big challenge, and I mean, putting it into kind of a book like this feels, on the one hand, a little bit dismissive. How do you actually capture real people's lives and deaths just in between, you know, the covers of a book? You can't really ever achieve that. But what I've tried to do here is to give more of a sense of some of the victims that I speak about. I tend to focus more on the victims rather than the perpetrators. You know, you may be aware there was a recent backlash against a famous sporting personality who was convicted of murdering his partner, and once again we saw sort of an international media focus being on the perpetrator rather than the victim. And so a lot of what we learn about press coverage in particular, and this is, I think, something that has changed over the years, but when we look back at the 1970s, for example, how women so often were blamed for their role in their own deaths. So women who were killed by their husbands were, when the press would write about them, they would say, oh, if only this woman had taken responsibility for her husband's poor behavior before he killed her, she might still be alive today. And it's quite staggering to see how that has really perpetuated over years, and how it's changed now, but we still sort of focus often on the wrong areas. And so part of the reason for writing this book in particular was to try and explain femicide in a very factual but also personal way, so that it was easier for people to understand the phenomenon over time, not just as single incidents that we see in the headlines occasionally. Because if we don't understand it, we can't beat it.
Right. And interestingly, you do that in the book, but also you have a second book, which is a novel, but also speaks about the very same themes around gender-based violence and femicide. Talk to me about it.
I mean, my friends think I'm quite gruesome. So my first book that came out this year is called 3 Bodies. It's a novel. It's a sequel to an earlier novel called Knucklebone. But even before my book on femicide came out, the story of 3 Bodies is about women's bodies being found across Gauteng. And interestingly, again, given the topicality of the subject right now, it involves femicide and human trafficking. And both of these books express different aspects of how we do and don't understand crime in our society. And I'm always intrigued by sort of the level of urban legend and myth. In fact, even in my femicide book, I write about the myth of child abductions and child trafficking, and how, if we continue to share false information, misleading information about crime, we never really solve the root of the problem. And The challenge is, especially right now, we see that misinformation and disinformation about crime is so prevalent because it preys on our emotions. We read a story about somebody trying to snatch a child, or we read a terrible story about what happened to a woman who was discovered somewhere, and it really hits us in the gut. And so instead of processing it sort of rationally, we process emotionally, and we share without thinking. And it's understandable why we do that, but it doesn't help us achieve what we want to, which is an end to violence against women and children.
Absolutely. Well, of course, I'm sure we can find those books. We can order them, right? Quickly,
yes,
where can we find them?
All of the major bookstores and online, any of the online services if you're still not venturing into physical stores just yet.
Right, Nechama Brodie, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
coming on to the South African Morning and sharing these books with us. But